The storm rolled in just after dusk, the kind of cold, heavy rain that soaked into the soil and made the whole valley feel older than it was. I had just finished checking the animals when I noticed something strange, the faint glow of a flashlight disappearing behind the hill near my root cellar. Nobody had permission to be on my land. Nobody had a reason to be near that door. Unless they were up to something. The HOA had been circling me for months, but one person in particular had taken it to another level. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of everything she didn't own. She hated that my ranch sat outside her HOA boundaries. She hated that she had no control over my buildings, my fences, or my choices. And she especially hated that the sheriff always sided with me. For weeks she'd been on a mission, trying to catch me breaking a rule that didn't apply to me. She took pictures of my tractor. She measured the height of my barn lights. She even tried to file a noise complaint against my rooster. Nothing worked, but last night she discovered my root cellar and decided that must be where I was hiding violations. The cellar sat under an old oak, reinforced with stone, built by my grandfather long before any HOA even existed. Inside were jars, dry goods, emergency supplies, and a climate system I'd just installed. Karen must have seen the technicians earlier that week and convinced herself I was running some kind of illegal bunker. I followed the small beam of her flashlight down the hill, keeping to the shadows. When she slipped inside the cellar, she didn't realize the door was weighted from the outside. Once it shut, it stayed shut, unless someone on the outside lifted the latch. I approached, quietly listening. Inside, shelves creaked, jars clinked, and her muffled voice muttered about evidence and finally catching me. She rifled through crates, moving deeper into the cellar, completely unaware she had walked into a place designed to stay sealed during emergencies. The rain hammered the ground harder, wind whipping around the door. I checked the padlock sitting beside the frame, the one I used only during storms to keep the latch from lifting. That's when I heard it, a thud from inside. Then another. Then her voice, louder, sharper, cracking with panic. She had just realized the door didn't open from the inside. And she was completely trapped. I took a slow breath, lifted the padlock, clicked it into place, and stepped back from the door. The sheriff's number was already ringing on my phone. The night was about to get interesting. The storm raged on, lightning slicing the sky and thunder rolling across the valley. But inside the root cellar, Karen's panic was even louder. Her flashlight flickered as she banged on the heavy wooden door, shrieking for someone to open it. Each shout echoed off the stone walls, but no one came, because no one should have been there in the first place. She had trespassed, and now the consequences were immediate. I stayed outside, leaning against the old oak, phone in hand, waiting for the sheriff to arrive. Karen pounded and cursed, trying to lift the latch that was designed to stay shut. She didn't know the cellar had been reinforced decades ago to withstand storms, floods, and intruders. Every attempt she made only confirmed the security measures were more than adequate. Her persistence was futile, and I could hear it in the way her breaths came faster, her shouts growing desperate. Minutes passed, or maybe it was half an hour. It's hard to track time when someone is panicking in the dark. I poured myself another coffee, shaking my head with a faint smile. Karen had underestimated me. She had underestimated the history of this land, the knowledge I carried about every corner of my property, and the measures I had put in place to protect it. Finally, the sheriff's truck appeared, headlights cutting through the rain. I waved him over, and he jumped out, umbrella in one hand, flashlight in the other. He didn't need an explanation at first glance. The open padlock, the reinforced door, and Karen's muffled yelling told him everything. He laughed quietly, shaking his head at the scene. "You didn't have to go this far," he said, though I knew the twinkle in his eye acknowledged she had it coming. Karen's voice grew frantic as she realized the sheriff had arrived. I was checking for violations, she shouted, though the muffled sound barely carried. The sheriff called to her, instructing her to stay calm and step out, except she couldn't. She tried again to push the door open, but the latch held firm. I stepped back, watching as the sheriff finally approached the door, noting the reinforced frame and the heavy stones. He gave me a nod, and together we eased the latch open. Karen stumbled out, drenched, shivering, and humiliated. Her board members, who had followed her in a separate vehicle, were standing a few yards back, mouths open in shock. They hadn't expected the plan to work, let alone work without any confrontation on my part. I handed her over to the sheriff, letting the legal authority take the reins. She was embarrassed, defeated, and utterly exposed. Her attempts to control me had ended in the very scenario she feared most: humiliation in front of her peers, her power nullified, and the sheriff confirming that she had no jurisdiction whatsoever over my property. As the rain subsided, I returned to the cellar, inspecting the shelves and supplies that Karen had disturbed. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, and for the first time, I felt the quiet satisfaction of justice delivered efficiently, legally, and with a touch of poetic irony. The storm outside mirrored the chaos Karen had brought to herself, and the calm I restored made it all the more satisfying. The night ended with her escorted away, the board members silent and reflective, and me standing on my porch looking over my land, knowing full well that some lessons are learned only the hard way, and some intruders never forget them. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the ranch damp but peaceful. Karen's failed intrusion had already become the talk among her board, whispers of humiliation and disbelief spreading faster than the puddles drying in the sun. The sheriff had filed a report confirming trespassing, and Karen's attempts to justify her actions had fallen flat. She had trespassed on private property, violated boundaries, and embarrassed herself in front of everyone. I walked the perimeter of the cellar, checking the locks and reinforcing a few minor spots, though the structure was already impenetrable. Each step reminded me how careful planning and knowledge of one's property could turn a situation completely in your favor. The cellar, meant for storage and emergencies, had become a trap only because Karen's arrogance made her reckless. Word reached the neighboring landowners, some of whom had witnessed her frantic flashlight and futile pounding. They laughed quietly among themselves, shaking their heads at the audacity of the HOA president, thinking she could intimidate someone whose land was well documented and protected. Karen had assumed fear or respect would bend me to her will, but the opposite had occurred. Her trespass highlighted my authority. By afternoon, the sheriff returned briefly to confirm all was in order. He shook his head with a smile, telling me some people need a night in a root cellar to understand boundaries. I chuckled, acknowledging that the situation had resolved itself without any escalation, other than the lesson Karen would carry with her. Meanwhile, Karen and her board tried to regroup, drafting letters of apology and attempting damage control. But the impact was done. Their credibility was diminished, their imagined authority over my property shattered. Every attempt they had made to intimidate or control me had only reinforced the legal and practical reality. I was in charge here. As evening fell, I stood outside the cellar. The door secure, the land quiet. The intruder had been removed, the lesson delivered, and the authority reaffirmed without violence or confrontation. Karen had learned the hard way. Trespass comes with consequences, and arrogance has no place on land you do not own.